The afternoon sun cut through the high windows of Building 47 at Fort Bragg, casting long shadows across the concrete floor as Sarah Mitchell pushed through the heavy metal door into the Special Operations Training Facility's locker room. She was 26, but could have passed for 20. Standing barely 5'4" in her standard-issue boots, slim-built with shoulders that seemed too narrow to carry the duffel bag she'd slung across her back. Her blonde hair was pulled into a regulation bun, and her face held that carefully neutral expression she'd perfected over the last 3 years. The kind of blank canvas that invited people to paint their own assumptions. The room fell into a particular kind of silence when she entered, the sort that's louder than conversation, where a dozen sets of eyes tracked her movement from the doorway to the empty locker at the far end. Jake Carson stood near the center bench, 6'2" and corn-fed confident, with the kind of easy swagger that came from never having been told he couldn't do something. He watched Sarah set down her bag with deliberate slowness, then exchanged a look with Marcus Webb, a muscular African-American man built like a linebacker who leaned against the lockers with his arms crossed. "You lost?" Marcus asked, not quite loud enough to be outright confrontational, but not quiet enough to be private. Derek Stone, the third point in their triangle, snorted from where he sat lacing his boots, a red-headed wall of muscle who'd played college football before the Army. Sarah didn't respond, just opened her locker and began methodically unpacking her gear. "New transfer," Jake said, loud enough now for everyone to hear, studying the roster sheet in his hand. "Sarah Mitchell. Says here she's Special Operations cleared." He said it like he was reading a punchline, and the room responded with scattered laughter. "Cleared for what? Clerical duty?" Derek muttered, and more laughter rippled through the space. Sarah hung her uniform carefully, her movements precise and economical, as if she were conserving energy for something these men couldn't yet see. Her fingers brushed across the collar of her spare shirt, unconsciously checking that it covered the scar tissue on her collarbone. Old habit, muscle memory from a different life. She could feel their eyes cataloging her, dismissing her, writing her story before she'd spoken a single word. The judgment settled over the room like humidity, thick and inescapable. And Sarah Mitchell did what she'd learned to do best. She breathed through it, stayed silent, and let them think whatever they needed to think. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. The training yard stretched across 2 acres of packed red clay, obstacle courses rising against the pale morning sky like mechanical serpents. Sarah stood in formation with 32 other candidates as Captain Richards, a weathered man in his early 50s with silver threading through his dark hair, outlined the day's physical assessment. 5-mile run in full gear, obstacle course, pack march, with 80 pounds of equipment, standard evaluation, he said, though nothing about the way he looked at the assembled soldiers suggested this would be standard at all. Sarah completed the run in 38 minutes, placing her solidly in the middle of the pack, not slow enough to fail, not fast enough to impress. She cleared the obstacle course without incident, her smaller frame actually advantageous on the rope climb and cargo net, though she lost time on the wall that required upper body strength to conquer. Jake finished 7 minutes ahead of her, Marcus close behind, both of them barely winded as they watched the remaining candidates struggle through. Then came the pack march, and this was where the whispers started. The equipment packs were loaded to exact specifications, 80 pounds of gear that needed to be carried 12 miles across varied terrain. Sarah hoisted hers onto her shoulders and felt the familiar bite of weight settling against her spine, the straps cutting into her collarbone exactly where the old injury lived beneath the fabric. Her pace was steady but labored, each step deliberate, and she could hear Jake's voice carrying across the formation behind her. $20, says she drops it before mile 3, he said, not bothering to lower his volume. "I'll take that bet and raise you," Derek responded. "Mile 2, tops." The laughter rolled through the squad like thunder before rain. Sarah's breathing stayed even, measured, her eyes fixed on the horizon point Captain Richards had indicated. At mile 4, her pack shifted and she had to stop to adjust it, fingers working the straps with practiced efficiency, and that's when Marcus jogged past. He called back, and the condescension dripped from every syllable. More laughter erupted from the men who'd clustered nearby to watch. Sarah pulled the strap tight, felt it drag across her shoulder, and her shirt collar shifted just enough to reveal the edge of the scar, a pale, twisted line that spoke of trauma and fire and things that shouldn't have been survived. She caught Captain Richards watching from 50 yards away, his expression unreadable behind military sunglasses, and she quickly adjusted her collar to cover the mark. He saw it, though. She knew he saw it. He said nothing, made no move to intervene in the mockery, just stood with his arms crossed and his jaw set. Sarah shouldered her pack again and continued walking, silent as stone, while behind her the squad's laughter faded into the sound of boots on clay and the distant cry of hawks circling overhead. The mess hall at 1800 hours was a cathedral of noise, metal trays clattering against tables, 200 voices competing for dominance in the cavernous space that smelled of industrial food and floor cleaner. Sarah sat alone at a corner table near the far wall, her tray arranged with mechanical precision, protein, vegetables, carbohydrates in their designated sections, and she ate slowly, methodically, each bite measured and purposeful. 3 tables away, Jake Carson held court with his usual audience, Marcus and Derek flanking him like lieutenants, while a half-dozen other squad members leaned in to catch every word. "Wilderness survival exercise starts Monday," Jake announced, loud enough to carry across the surrounding tables. 7 days, minimum supplies, mountain terrain. Command wants to see who's got what it takes. He stabbed a fork into his mashed potatoes for emphasis. "I'm calling it now. Mitchell won't make it past day 2. Derek laughed, the sound sharp and mean. "Day 2? You're being generous. I say she taps out before the first night. Probably cry for extraction the second it gets dark." "Or cold," Marcus added, warming to the theme. "She's what, maybe 110 pounds? First time the temperature drops below 40. She'll be hypothermic." Sarah's fork paused halfway to her mouth, a piece of chicken suspended in air, and for just a moment her eyes went somewhere else entirely. The mess hall faded, replaced by something darker, colder, a memory of gnawing hunger that made this institutional food look like a feast, of nights when 40 degrees would have felt like luxury compared to the freezing rain that had soaked through her torn uniform while she'd pressed herself into a drainage ditch, enemy patrol boots splashing through mud 3 feet from her face. Her hand trembled almost imperceptibly. Then Jake's voice cut through again. $20 says she's out in 48 hours. Any takers?" And Sarah blinked, snapped back to the present, the fork completing its journey to her mouth. She chewed slowly, swallowed, took a sip of water. The conversation continued behind her. Bets being placed, odds being calculated. Her failure treated as foregone conclusion and entertainment both. Someone suggested making a pool, tracking the exact hour she'd quit. More laughter. The kind that feeds on itself and grows cruel. Sarah set down her fork, stared at her half-finished tray for a long moment, then stood and carried it to the dish return. She walked past Jake's table on her way out, close enough to hear Marcus say, "Hope they factor in rescue costs when they finally admit she doesn't belong here." She didn't break stride, didn't acknowledge them, just pushed through the mess hall doors into the cool evening air, where the sound of their mockery finally, mercifully, faded into silence. The briefing room was stark, white walls and fluorescent lighting. Rows of folding chairs facing a projection screen that displayed topographical maps of the Uhari Mountains. Captain Richards stood at the podium, pointer in hand, outlining the parameters of the exercise with military precision. 7 days, he explained, in wilderness terrain that ranged from dense forest to rocky ridgelines. Each team would receive 1 pack with basic supplies, fire starter, water purification tablets, minimal first aid, emergency beacon for life-threatening situations only. The goal was survival, evasion, and successful navigation to 3 checkpoint coordinates spread across 40 miles of unforgiving landscape. "You'll be assigned to teams of 4, Richards continued, clicking to the next slide, showing team rosters. Teamwork is essential. Communication, resource sharing, mutual support. He paused, eyes scanning the room until they found Sarah sitting in the back row, separated from the main cluster of candidates. Mitchell has requested solo assignment. I've approved it. The room shifted, a collective turning of heads to stare at her. Jake's voice carried from the third row, not quite a whisper. Can't find anyone willing to carry her weight. Scattered snickers rippled through the seats. Marcus leaned toward Derek, stage whispering. Or she knows she can't keep up with a team. Going solo means only disappointing herself. More laughter, barely suppressed. Sarah sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, face betraying nothing. Captain Richards let the moment hang there, his gaze moving from Sarah to the mocking squad members, and back again. Something flickered in his expression, not disapproval, but recognition. The kind of look that said he'd read a file these men hadn't, knew a story they couldn't imagine. The solo assignment, he said slowly, deliberately, is actually the more difficult option. No shared resources, no backup, complete self-reliance. He clicked to the next slide, showing Sarah's designated zone, the most remote, most challenging terrain in the exercise area. Takes a particular kind of experience to survive alone. The way he said experience made it sound like a title, something earned rather than learned, and for just a moment his eyes met Sarah's across the room in silent understanding before he moved on to the next briefing point. The Black Hawk helicopters sat on the tarmac like giant insects, rotors beginning their slow spin as dawn broke gray and cold across Fort Bragg. Sarah stood with her assigned pack lighter than the others, she noticed, because there was no weight to distribute among teammates watching the other squads load up with their gear, boisterous and confident despite the early hour. The temperature hovered around 42 degrees, wind cutting across the airfield with enough bite to make breath visible. Jake's team loaded into the first helicopter, Marcus and Derek joining two other candidates, their packs stuffed with shared supplies and collective confidence. The second and third birds filled with similar teams, men joking and pushing each other, treating this like an adventure rather than a test. Sarah waited alone for the fourth helicopter, the one that would take her north to the most remote section of the Uvari Range. Captain Richards had shown her the map privately, the terrain marked with steep elevation changes, minimal water sources, and areas marked difficult passage in red ink. Jake appeared at her elbow as she checked her pack straps one final time, his shadow falling across her in the weak morning light. "Hey, Mitchell," he said, loud enough for his team to hear from inside their helicopter. "We'll send the rescue bird for you tomorrow around noon. That give you enough time to realize you're in over your head?" His grin was wide and self-satisfied, the smile of someone who'd never been proven wrong. Sarah looked up at him. This tall, confident man who'd spent days measuring her against his assumptions, and something shifted in her expression. It wasn't anger or defiance, nothing so obvious. Instead, her lips curved into a slight smile, knowing and distant, the kind of expression that held years of context he couldn't begin to understand. For just a moment, brief enough that Jake would later wonder if he'd imagined it, he felt something cold settle in his stomach, a flicker of uncertainty that made no logical sense. Then Sarah turned away, shouldered her pack with practiced ease, and walked toward her waiting helicopter. She climbed in without looking back, and as the bird lifted off, Jake watched her disappear into the gray morning, that unsettling smile lingering in his memory like smoke. The command tent buzzed with activity on day 2, radio operators monitoring 6 different frequencies as teams checked in with their 24-hour status reports. Jake's team reported from grid reference Charlie 7. Voices crackling through static. They were cold, tired, had managed to start a fire on the 3rd attempt, and one member had twisted an ankle on the rocky descent from their drop point but could still walk. Team 2 called in 15 minutes later. Similar story. Wet sleeping bags and low morale but functional. Team 3 had lost their fire starter crossing a stream and spent the night shivering. But they'd located their first checkpoint. Captain Richards stood at the center table, arms crossed, watching the map where colored pins marked each team's last known position. The radio operator adjusted his headset, tried another frequency, then looked up. "Sir." No contact from Mitchell. "Equipment failure?" "Maybe. Her beacon's not transmitting." Outside the tent, Jake and Marcus had wandered over during their check-in, close enough to overhear. Jake's laugh carried into the command space. "Day 2 and she's already gone dark." "Told you." Probably huddled under a tree crying. Richard's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, just stared at the empty space on the map where Sarah's pin should have been. He looked concerned. Yes, but not surprised. More like he was watching something inevitable unfold, something he'd seen before. What Richards couldn't see, what none of them could know, was happening 43 miles northwest in a ravine sheltered from wind by 2 massive boulders. Sarah worked with methodical efficiency in the fading afternoon light, weaving pine boughs through a framework of branches she'd lashed together using cord stripped from her pack's interior lining. The shelter was low, nearly invisible against the rock face, insulated with layers of dried leaves and positioned to trap heat while remaining concealed from above. These weren't techniques from any manual they'd studied. This was survival stripped down to its essence, learned in places where textbook methods meant death. She disabled her beacon deliberately that morning, smashed the transmitter with a rock after confirming her location. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing in wilderness wasn't nature at all, and old instincts died hard. The shelter complete. Sarah crawled inside, checked the snare line she'd set an hour earlier, and settled in to wait for darkness, with the patience of someone who'd learned that survival wasn't about comfort. It was about becoming invisible. Day 4 arrived with freezing rain that turned the mountain terrain into a misery of mud and cold that seeped through every layer of clothing. Jake's team huddled in their inadequate shelter, sharing the last of their emergency ration bars, nursing blisters, and the quiet realization that 7 days might be longer than any of them had anticipated. Marcus had developed a cough that rattled in his chest. Derek's ankle injury from day 1 had worsened into a swollen purple mass, and morale had shifted from confident to grimly determined. They'd made their morning check-in with command, Jake deliberately asking if there'd been any word from Mitchell, expecting confirmation of her rescue or failure, only to be told there was still no contact, no beacon activation, nothing. "She's probably dead in a ditch somewhere," Derek muttered through chattering teeth. Though the joke landed flat in their current misery. They were attempting to navigate toward their second checkpoint, following a ridgeline that offered the most direct route, when Marcus stopped abruptly and pointed down into the ravine below. "Is that?" Through the gray curtain of rain, maybe 300 yards distant, a figure moved along the ravine floor with purposeful strides. Small frame, blonde hair darkened by wet, unmistakably Sarah Mitchell. But what made Jake's breath catch wasn't just seeing her, it was where she was and how she moved. The ravine was choked with deadfall and thorny undergrowth they'd dismissed as impassable yesterday. Yet she navigated through it like water flowing downhill, each step placed with absolute certainty, and draped across her shoulders, tied with what looked like stripped bark, was the unmistakable form of a rabbit, freshly killed. How did she? Marcus started, but Sarah had already disappeared into the tree line, moving perpendicular to their position, headed somewhere with clear purpose. She hadn't looked up, hadn't acknowledged their presence, though she must have known they were there. The ridgeline was exposed, visible for half a mile in either direction. Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach, the same unsettling sensation from the airfield amplified now. They were cold, hungry, struggling with basic survival, and she was hunting, thriving, moving through terrain with the confidence of someone who'd done this before, in ways that made their training exercise look like summer camp. "That's not possible," Derek said quietly, staring at the empty space where she'd been. "We've been eating bark, and she's got fresh meat?" Nobody answered, because the evidence of their eyes contradicted everything they'd assumed, and the rain kept falling while somewhere below them, Sarah Mitchell disappeared into wilderness like she'd been born to it. Jake's team stumbled into base camp at 1400 hours on day 5. a full 2 days before the exercise was scheduled to end, and the sight of them told the story before any words were spoken. Derek was limping badly, supported between Jake and Marcus, his ankle now the size of a grapefruit. All three were hollow-eyed, shivering despite the afternoon sun, covered in mud and scratches and the unmistakable look of men who'd pushed themselves to the edge and found it closer than expected. Captain Richards met them at the medical tent, watching as the medic examined Derek's ankle and pronounced it a severe sprain requiring immediate treatment. "We need to talk about Mitchell," Jake said once they'd been cleared, his voice hoarse from days of cold and insufficient water. "Sir, we saw her on day 4. She was in the Lower Creek Ravine, moving through terrain we couldn't even attempt. And she had game a rabbit, like she'd been hunting." Marcus nodded emphatically. "It doesn't make sense. We've been starving, and she's thriving out there." By 1600 hours, 2 more teams had returned early, equally battered, equally defeated by conditions they'd underestimated. The debriefing room filled with exhausted candidates who discovered that survival wasn't a theoretical exercise, and gradually the conversation turned to the one person still out there, the one they'd written off as the first failure. "Has Mitchell been extracted?" someone asked. And Richards shook his head slowly. "She made contact yesterday via emergency beacon," he said, and the room went silent with attention. "Not requesting extraction, just confirming her position and status. She's completing the full 7 days." The words landed like stones in still water. Jake felt his face flush. Confusion mixing with something that felt uncomfortably like shame. They'd mocked her, bet against her, laughed at her supposed weakness. And now they were sitting in warm buildings with hot food while she remained out there by choice, capable of something they clearly weren't. "That's impossible," Derek said flatly. "No one survives solo out there that long. Not comfortably." But the map on Richard's wall said otherwise. Sarah's position marked in the most remote, most challenging terrain. And the confusion in the room slowly curdled into resentment, the particular kind that comes when assumptions are proven wrong and pride has nowhere to hide. Sarah Mitchell walked into base camp at 1000 hours on day 7, exactly when the exercise was scheduled to conclude, and the sight of her stopped conversations mid-sentence. She wasn't broken or exhausted or barely surviving. She was calm. Her uniform dirty but not destroyed. Her pack lighter than when she'd left, and her movements carried the easy efficiency of someone who'd spent a week doing exactly what she'd intended. Her hair was still pulled back neatly, face smudged with dirt but not haggard. And when she approached the debriefing tent, she carried something wrapped in large leaves that still steamed slightly in the cool morning air. Captain Richards stood at the entrance, and Sarah nodded to him before unwrapping her package on the check-in table. A rabbit, expertly field-dressed, cooked over coals, the meat falling off the bones. "Saved some from last night," she said simply, her voice quiet but steady. Thought the cadre might want to verify the trapping technique. The debriefing room had filled with the squads who'd returned early, and the hostility was immediate and palpable. Jake stood near the back, his face darkening as he watched Sarah calmly present evidence of competence they couldn't match. Marcus pushed forward, his voice sharp with accusation. "This is bullshit. There's no way you survived solo for 7 days in that terrain and came back looking like you spent a weekend camping." Other voices joined in, a chorus of disbelief and wounded pride. Derek limped forward on his bandaged ankle, pointing at the rabbit. "You had help. Had to. Someone dropped you supplies, gave you equipment we didn't have." The accusations flew faster. She'd cheated, violated the exercise parameters, had outside support, wasn't actually in her assigned zone. The room grew heated, voices overlapping, all of them needing an explanation that preserved their understanding of how things should work, because the alternative was accepting that this small, quiet woman they dismissed had capabilities that made their struggle look like failure. Sarah stood at the center of it all, hands at her sides, face neutral, and said nothing. She didn't defend herself, didn't argue, didn't protest their accusations. She simply let them vent their frustration and confusion and resentment. absorbing it like silence absorbs sound, and her very stillness seemed to amplify their agitation until Captain Richards finally raised his hand and the room fell into reluctant, hostile quiet. The training hall smelled of rubber mats and sweat, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as Sergeant Instructor Mills walked down the line of paired candidates for hand-to-hand combat drills. Basic close-quarters techniques, he explained. Emphasis on leverage and control. 30-second rounds with rotating partners. The resentment from the survival exercise still hung in the air like humidity. And when Mills reached Sarah, he paused, eyes scanning the remaining unpaired candidates before settling on Derek Stone. "Stone, you're with Mitchell," Mills said, and the room shifted with anticipation. Derek was 6'2", 210 pounds of former college linebacker, his injured ankle now wrapped and cleared for light training. Sarah stood 5'4" and maybe 115 pounds, and the size differential looked almost comical as they faced each other on the mat. Jake leaned against the wall, arms crossed, a smile playing at his lips. "This ought to be good," he muttered to Marcus, loud enough to carry. "Maybe she'll actually quit after this." Mills blew the whistle, and Derek moved in with confident aggression, reaching to establish a collar tie that would let him use his weight advantage. What happened next took less than 4 seconds, but seemed to unfold in slow motion for everyone watching. Sarah didn't retreat or try to match his strength. Instead, she moved into his reach, her hand snapping up to redirect his arm at an angle that violated basic training doctrine, simultaneously stepping offline in a movement that put her outside his power structure. Derek tried to adjust, reaching with his other hand, and Sarah's elbow came up in a tight arc that would have shattered his nose if she'd followed through, stopping a half-inch from contact. Then she was behind him somehow, her leg hooking his in a sweep that used his own momentum, and Derek went down hard on the mat with Sarah's knee pressed against his spine and her forearm across the back of his neck in a position that could have choked him unconscious in seconds. The whistle blew. The room was silent. Derek lay there, confused and winded, trying to process how he'd ended up on the ground. Sarah released him immediately, stepped back, offered a hand to help him up that he ignored as he rolled to his feet, face flushed with embarrassment and shock. Her movements hadn't been from any manual they'd studied. They were efficient, brutal, stripped of unnecessary flourish, the kind of technique that came from places where second place meant death. Mills stared at her, recognition dawning in his expression, and the silence stretched until Jake's voice cut through it. Quieter now. Uncertain. What the hell was that? The outdoor range stretched across 100 yards of cleared ground, target silhouettes standing at various distances like silent sentries. Master Sergeant Chen ran the tactical shooting qualification, clipboard in hand, watching candidates cycle through their 40-round course, 10 shots at each distance from 25 to 100 yards, standing and prone positions. Sarah stepped to the line with her issued M4, checked the weapon with practiced movements, and settled into her stance. What Chen noticed first was her breathing, not the standard 4-count combat breathing they taught, but something else. A deeper rhythm that seemed to slow time itself. Her stance was subtly wrong too. Weight distribution shifted in ways that shouldn't work according to doctrine, but somehow did. She fired her first group of 10 at the 25-yard target, smooth and unhurried. Each shot separated by exactly the same interval. Chen walked downrange after the ceasefire and stood staring at the target for a long moment before calling back. "Retrieve that target." When he brought it to the observation table, Jake and several others crowded around. The 10 shots hadn't just hit center mass, they'd gone through the same hole. A ragged circle no bigger than a quarter in the exact center of the scoring ring. "Lucky group," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. Sarah completed the remaining 3 distances with identical results, perfect groupings that defied statistical probability. Each cluster tight enough to cover with a fist. Chen watched her in silence, seeing things in her technique that spoke of training environments far removed from Fort Bragg's polished ranges. Jake's frustration finally boiled over. "The moving target course," he said, stepping forward. "You want to prove something, run that. Facility record is 2 minutes 40 seconds. Sarah turned to him, that same slight smile from the helicopter appearing again. "All right," she said quietly, then looked at Chen. "Can we run it at dusk? Another 20 minutes? Chen glanced at the fading light, the sun already below the tree line. "It'll be nearly dark." "I know," Sarah said. 20 minutes later, in the gray twilight that made the pop-up targets almost invisible, Sarah stepped to the starting line. The course was brutal, 12 moving targets at unknown distances, obstacles requiring transition between positions, simulated stress factors. Chen started the timer, and Sarah moved like water through the course, her rifle tracking targets that most shooters couldn't even see clearly in the failing light, each shot precise and unhurried. When she finished, Chen stared at his stopwatch in disbelief. 2 minutes, 18 seconds, and every target center mass hits. The silence that followed was different than before, not just surprise, but the dawning realization that they'd been wrong about something fundamental. And that whatever Sarah Mitchell was, she wasn't anything they'd assumed. The barracks common room felt smaller, with 8 men crowded into it, the door closed against the evening foot traffic outside. Jake sat at the center table with his laptop open, Marcus and Derek flanking him, while 4 other squad members from various teams formed a loose circle around them. The air was thick with cigarette smoke despite regulations, and the mood had shifted from mockery to something harder, more unsettled. "Pull up her service record," Derek said, leaning over Jake's shoulder. "There has to be something that explains this." Jake navigated through the military personnel database, typing in Sarah Mitchell's name and service number. The file loaded slowly, and what appeared on screen was more notable for what it didn't say than what it did. Name: Mitchell Sarah J. Rank: Specialist. Age: 26. Enlisted: 3 years prior. Moss: Redacted. Previous deployments. Classified: Special Operations Clearance. Yes. Current assignment: Advanced Training Rotation. Commendations: Redacted. Medical history: Redacted. The file was a skeleton, stripped of everything that might tell her actual story. And where there should have been details, there was only black ink and bureaucratic euphemisms for secrets. "That's not normal," Marcus said, his voice tight. "Even classified assignments show something. This is like she barely exists." Jake scrolled down, looking for anything useful, but every section that mattered was blocked behind security clearances. None of them possessed. 3 years in service, but her record looked like someone had taken an eraser to her entire military existence. The frustration in the room built like pressure in a sealed container until Jake slammed the laptop shut and stood abruptly. Richards knows. He has to know. The way he looks at her, the solo assignment, he knows exactly who she is. 10 minutes later, they were at Captain Richards' office, Jake knocking hard enough to rattle the door in its frame. Richards looked up from his paperwork, unsurprised, as if he'd been expecting this confrontation. "Captain, we need to know about Mitchell," Jake said without preamble. "Her file is redacted to hell." "What aren't we being told?" Richards set down his pen slowly, deliberately, his expression hardening. "That's classified information, Carson, and you know it." "Classified?" Marcus pushed forward. "Sir, she's making us look like amateurs. She survived alone better than full teams. She fights like special forces, shoots like a sniper. We have a right to know who we're training with." Richard stood, and despite being shorter than Jake, his presence filled the room. "You have a right to nothing except what I tell you. Mitchell's previous service is her business and command's business. What you need to know is that she earned her clearance through experience you can't imagine. And she's earned her place in this program." "That's not good enough," Jake said, anger finally breaking through military courtesy. "How are we supposed to trust?" "Trust!" Richards cut him off, voice sharp as broken glass. "You've spent days mocking her, betting against her, questioning her capability. Now you want trust? She doesn't owe you her story, Carson. She's proven herself every single day, while you've proven nothing except your own assumptions." The words landed like physical blows, and the room went silent. Richard stared at each of them in turn, his disappointment palpable. "Dismissed. All of you." The urban warfare simulator was a maze of concrete buildings, narrow alleyways, and multi-story structures designed to replicate hostile city environments, covering 3 acres of Fort Bragg's training grounds. Lieutenant Hayes briefed the exercise parameters: hunter-killer scenario, simulated ammunition. 1 defender against multiple attackers. 30-minute time limit. He asked for volunteers, and Sarah's hand went up immediately, her voice quiet but clear. "I'll be the hunted." The room reacted with confused glances. Hayes frowned, clearly about to suggest the opposite configuration, but Sarah continued. 4 hunters. Give me 5 minutes to position, then release them." It seemed absurd, unfair in the wrong direction. 4 experienced soldiers with numerical and tactical advantage against 1 small woman in an environment designed for team coordination. Jake exchanged looks with Marcus, Derek, and another squad member named Thompson. And something mean flickered in Jake's expression. "We'll do it," he said. Maybe this would finally expose whatever trick she'd been using, prove she wasn't as capable as her performance suggested. Sarah disappeared into the simulator complex, and 5 minutes later, the horn sounded. Jake's team entered tactically sound, weapons up, moving in a standard diamond formation that covered sight lines and prevented flanking. They'd trained for this exact scenario dozens of times. The first indication something was wrong came at minute 7, when Thompson's vest lit up, hit registered from an angle that shouldn't have been possible, from a window they'd already cleared. Thompson was out. Confused. Swearing he'd checked that position. The remaining 3 tightened formation, moved more cautiously through an intersection. And Derek's vest lit up at minute 12, shot from above, from a fire escape they hadn't considered accessible. Now Jake was sweating despite the cool air. The scenario feeling less like training and more like being prey. He and Marcus split up against Doctrine, trying to cover more ground. And that's when Sarah struck again. Marcus's vest registered hits at minute 16, the shots coming from ground level behind a dumpster that hadn't provided adequate cover when they'd passed it 3 minutes earlier, meaning she'd moved into position after they'd cleared it, using their own movement pattern against them. Jake was alone now, heart pounding with frustration and something close to fear, his weapon tracking every shadow. He moved through a narrow alley, methodical, checking corners, and his vest lit up at minute 19 with hits from directly behind him. She'd been there the whole time, following him, invisible. The horn sounded exercise complete, and Jake spun around to find Sarah standing 15 feet away, weapon lowered, not even breathing hard. The frustration that had been building for days finally erupted, and Jake threw his training rifle down hard enough to crack the stock against concrete. His voice raw with anger. "What the hell are you?" Morning formation assembled at 0600 on the parade ground. 3 rows of candidates standing at attention in the cold dawn, while Captain Richards conducted routine announcements. Sarah stood in the back row, eyes forward, breath misting in the freezing air. And she felt the tension building before anything was said, the way Jake kept shifting his weight 3 spots to her left, the whispered exchange between Marcus and Derek in the row ahead. Richards was mid-sentence about the day's training schedule when Jake broke formation, stepping forward with a kind of deliberate motion that announced intention. "Captain, I need to address something," Jake said, his voice carrying across the parade ground. Richards stopped, turned slowly, his expression darkening. "Carson, return to formation." "No, sir. Respectfully, this needs to be said." Jake turned to face Sarah directly, and the entire company shifted their attention like a spotlight swinging across a stage. "Mitchell, where did you really train? Because everything you've shown us, the survival skills, the combat technique, the shooting that's not standard army training, you've been lying about your experience." Sarah's face remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes, a tightness around her jaw that hadn't been there before. She said nothing. "We checked your file," Marcus added, stepping forward to join Jake. and Derek followed despite his injured ankle, the three of them forming a wall of accusation. "It's all redacted, classified. You're hiding something and we deserve to know what." Other voices joined in from the formation. Candidates who'd been nursing their wounded pride for days, emboldened by Jake's public challenge. "Where were you deployed? Who trained you? What aren't you telling us?" The questions came faster, overlapping, and through it all Sarah stood perfectly still, hands at her sides, letting the anger and suspicion wash over her without response. Her silence seemed to enrage them further, and Jake took another step closer. "Say something!" he demanded. "Defend yourself! Tell us we're wrong!" "Carson!" Captain Richard's voice cracked like a gunshot across the parade ground, and everyone froze. He strode forward, fury radiating from every step, positioning himself between Jake and Sarah. "You are out of line, Specialist. Return to formation immediately." "Sir, we have a right. You have the right to follow orders." Richard's face was inches from Jake's now, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Stand down, Carson. That is a direct order." The tension hung there, crystallized in the frozen morning air, Jake and Richards locked in a stare that could have ignited gunpowder. The entire company held its breath, waiting for something to break. Because this moment had been building for days, and it couldn't sustain itself much longer. Something had to give, had to crack open and release the pressure before they all exploded with it. The briefing room was packed at 1400 hours. Every seat filled for what Captain Richards had announced as the capstone exercise, a simulated hostage rescue in enemy territory, the highest pressure scenario in the training pipeline. The projection screen showed a compound layout, guard rotations, time constraints that would push every skill they'd developed to its absolute limit. Richard stood at the podium, pointer in hand, explaining the parameters with military precision. 12-hour time limit. Teams of 6. One squad member would be designated as hostage and held in the compound while the others planned and executed extraction. Failure meant starting the entire training cycle over. The stakes had never been higher. Jake sat in the third row, arms crossed, and when Richards paused to take questions, his hand shot up. "Will Mitchell be participating, sir? Because if she is, we need to know what we're actually working with. Can't plan a mission with an unknown variable." The antagonism in his voice was barely concealed, and several other candidates nodded agreement. Richard's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping near his temple, and something in his expression shifted, a decision being made in real time, a line being crossed. He set down his pointer with deliberate care, then turned to face the room fully. "Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying an edge that made everyone sit straighter. "Front and center." Sarah stood slowly from her seat in the back row, and even from across the room people could see her reluctance, the way her shoulders tensed as she walked to the front. She stopped beside Richards, hands clasped in front of her, eyes fixed on some point above the assembled candidates' heads. "Sir," she said quietly, and it might have been a question or a protest, but Richards cut her off. "These soldiers have questions about your qualifications," Richards said, his tone formal now. "Official. I think it's time they understood exactly who they've been training with. Present your qualification brief, Specialist Mitchell." "That's an order." Sarah's face went pale, her hands tightening their grip on each other. "Captain, I don't think that wasn't a request." Richard's voice was steel. "You've spent days absorbing their mockery, their accusations, their disrespect. They want to know where you trained? Tell them. They want to know about your experience? Show them." The room had gone completely silent, the kind of silence that precedes revelation. And every eye was locked on Sarah's face as she stood there, clearly wrestling with something internal and painful. Her breath came faster, shallow, and for a long moment it seemed like she might refuse the order. Then she nodded once, barely perceptible, and turned to face the assembled squad with eyes that had suddenly gone very far away, seeing things none of them could imagine. Sarah stood at the front of the room for a long moment, her hands still clasped tightly together. Then she pulled a folder from her cargo pocket, worn, creased, the kind of thing that had been carried and handled too many times. She opened it carefully, extracted several photographs, and placed them on the projector table where the overhead camera would display them on the screen behind her. 6 faces appeared, enlarged for the entire room to see 5 men and Sarah, younger by 3 years, all of them in desert combat uniforms with mountains in the background. 3 years ago, Sarah began, her voice steady but flat, stripped of inflection like she was reading from a script she'd memorized to survive the telling. I was deployed as part of a 6-person reconnaissance team in hostile territory. Covert insertion, intelligence, gathering on enemy supply routes and command structures. We'd been in country for 17 days. She paused, her finger hovering over each face in the photograph. Sergeant Michael Torres, team leader. Specialist James Chen, communications. Corporal David Martinez, medic. Private First Class Tyler Brooks, youngest on the team, 20 years old. Staff Sergeant Robert Wilson, our most experienced operator. Her voice caught almost imperceptibly on the last name, then continued. And me, I was the intelligence analyst and secondary communications. The room was motionless, Jake's earlier antagonism forgotten as every person leaned forward unconsciously. Sarah's eyes stayed fixed on the photograph, and there was something in her expression, now grief, carefully controlled but unmistakably present. Day 18. Our convoy was moving through a mountain pass when we were ambushed. RPG hit the lead vehicle before we even knew they were there. The explosion. She stopped, breathed once, twice, then continued. 5 of my team were killed instantly. The blast radius, the shrapnel. There was nothing anyone could have done. She clicked to the next image. A map with terrain features marked in red. I was thrown from the vehicle, knocked unconscious. When I woke up, our convoy was destroyed. My team was dead, and I could hear enemy patrols converging on the position. I was 400 miles behind enemy lines in territory where every civilian was hostile. Every patrol was hunting survivors, and I had no radio, no extraction possibility, and no support. Another photograph, Sarah's official casualty notification, stamped with the word Presumed, deceased in red letters. Command declared me Kia after 72 hours with no contact. My family was notified. My funeral was scheduled. Her voice remained steady through all of it, but her eyes told a different story. They were somewhere else entirely, seeing things that still lived behind her eyelids in the dark hours before dawn, and the room had transformed from hostile audience to horrified witnesses in the space of 3 minutes. Sarah clicked to the next slide, a bulleted list that reduced 73 days of hell to clinical facts, and her voice took on the quality of an after-action report, the only way she could speak about it without breaking. I spent the first 48 hours hiding in a culvert 200 meters from the ambush site, listening to enemy forces search for survivors. I had 2 broken ribs from the blast, a dislocated left shoulder, shrapnel wounds across my back and legs, and a concussion that left me vomiting for 3 days. She touched her collarbone unconsciously, the gesture explaining the scar they'd glimpsed during training. I reset my own shoulder on day 3, using a tree trunk for leverage because I couldn't move properly without it. The pain made me pass out twice. The room was silent, except for her voice, steady and relentless. I moved only at night, covering maybe 5 to 8 miles when I was strong enough. Less when I wasn't. No fires, smoke draws attention. I foraged for anything edible. Learned what the local population ate by watching from a distance. Some days I survived on less than 500 calories, mostly wild plants and insects. On day 19, I managed to trap a rabbit using wire from the destroyed convoy. That was the first real protein I'd had. She clicked again, showing a map with her movement track marked in stages. I stole from enemy camps 3 times, waited until their guard rotations created gaps, took food and medical supplies. The wounds on my back got infected around day 30. I had no antibiotics, treated it with stolen field medicine, and honey I found in an abandoned building changed the dressing with fabric torn from my uniform. Her hand moved to her shoulder again. By day 40, I'd lost approximately 35 pounds. I was hypothermic more nights than not, fighting fever from infection, and I'd accepted that extraction wasn't coming, that survival meant reaching friendly territory on foot or dying in the attempt. The final photograph she displayed made several people in the room inhale sharply. Sarah at extraction, photographed by the Special Forces team that had found her on day 73. She was unrecognizable, emaciated to the point of skeletal, eyes hollow and enormous in a face that had lost all softness. Her uniform hanging off a frame that looked like it might collapse at any moment. That girl in the photograph was a ghost. Something that had survived past the point where survival should have been possible, and the contrast between that image and the woman standing before them now was so stark, it rewrote every assumption they'd built about who she was. The silence in the room was absolute. The kind of quiet that feels physical, pressing against eardrums and making breath seem too loud. Sarah stood at the front, still looking at that final photograph of herself as a ghost, and when she spoke again her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing everyone to strain forward to hear. "I survived by becoming invisible," she said. "I learned enemy patrol patterns, memorized their schedules down to the minute, understood their assumptions about where someone would hide, and chose everywhere else. I adapted to conditions that should have killed me by accepting that comfort was a luxury I couldn't afford, that every calorie mattered, that sleep was something you stole in 20-minute intervals. Every technique you've seen me use, the shelter building, the hunting, the combat moves, the shooting in darkness. I didn't learn those in a classroom or on a training range. I learned them during those 73 days because learning them was the difference between surviving one more night or dying alone in a country that wanted me dead." She clicked to the final slide, a citation document with official seals. "I received the Silver Star for the survival and the intelligence I gathered during evasion. I spent 8 months in psychological recovery at Walter Reed, learning how to sleep without a weapon in my hand, how to eat regular meals, how to exist around people without calculating exit routes and threat assessments." Her eyes finally left the screen and swept across the room, meeting faces that now showed horror, shame, understanding. "I didn't tell you any of this because I'm trying to move forward, not live in the past. I'm not that girl in the photograph anymore. I've worked for 3 years to become someone who can function normally, who can train without the ghosts following me into every exercise. But you wanted to know where I trained. What made me different?" She paused, and her voice went very quiet. "Now you know. I trained in hell, and I survived it. And every single day since then has been easy by comparison." Jake's face had gone ashen, his earlier confidence and anger replaced by something that looked like he might be sick. Marcus stared at his hands, unable to meet her eyes. Derek's mouth was open slightly, frozen in an expression of dawning horror at what they'd done, how they'd treated her, what their mockery must have felt like to someone carrying that weight. Captain Richard stood to the side, arms crossed, letting the moment breathe, letting them all sit with the crushing realization of their own blindness. The briefing room emptied slowly after Sarah's presentation, candidates moving like people waking from a nightmare, and the normal sounds of military life, boots on floors, equipment rattling. Casual conversation felt wrong somehow, too ordinary for what had just been revealed. Sarah collected her photographs with careful hands, sliding them back into the worn folder, and she was aware of the eyes on her. The whispered conversations that stopped when she passed, but mostly she felt exhausted, hollowed out by having spoken things she'd worked 3 years to bury. Jake found her 2 hours later behind the equipment shed, sitting on a concrete barrier and staring at nothing. He approached slowly, hands shoved in his pockets, and stopped 6 feet away like he was afraid to come closer. "Mitchell, he started, then stopped. Because what words could possibly be adequate? "I'm sorry" felt laughably insufficient for days of mockery directed at someone who'd survived what she'd survived. "I didn't know" was true, but sounded like excuse-making. "I was wrong" didn't begin to cover the magnitude of his misjudgment. Sarah looked up at him, her expression neutral and tired, and after a long moment she simply nodded. Once, not forgiveness, not acceptance, just acknowledgement that he'd tried to say something that couldn't be said. Then she stood and walked past him toward the training compound. And Jake stood there feeling like he'd failed a test he hadn't known he was taking. The hostage rescue drill began at 2200 hours. Full darkness and live simulated ammunition. The compound lit by artificial moonlight and searchlights. Sarah's team consisted of Jake, Marcus, Derek, and 2 others. And when they gathered for mission planning, something fundamental had shifted. Jake, who'd always taken point in every exercise, deferred to Sarah without being asked. Marcus spread the compound map on the table and waited for her assessment. Derek, despite his usual aggressive tactics, listened when she outlined their approach. A 3-phase infiltration using blind spots in the guard rotation she'd identified in 60 seconds of observation. They moved through the exercise like a single organism. Sarah's quiet directions followed instantly and without question, not because of rank, but because they'd finally understood what they should have seen from the beginning, that her authority came from competence, earned in places where mistakes meant death, and her silence wasn't weakness, but the stillness of someone who'd learned that survival sometimes meant becoming invisible even in a crowd of allies. The extraction took 11 minutes. Flawless execution. And when the evaluators called exercise complete, the team stood together in the darkness, and nobody spoke, because the dynamics had completely shifted, and they all knew nothing would ever be the same. 2 months passed, and Fort Bragg's Special Operations Training Facility had transformed in ways that couldn't be measured in policy changes or official directives but were visible in every interaction, every training evolution, every quiet moment when assumptions might have taken root but didn't. Sarah Mitchell held no rank above the other candidates, no formal leadership position. Yet when her squad moved through exercises, she was the one they looked to, the one whose assessment mattered, whose quiet suggestions carried the weight of experience that couldn't be faked or taught. Her story had spread through the facility like wind through grass, whispered in mess halls and barracks, until everyone knew about the 73 days, and the culture shifted from machismo performance to something harder to define but impossible to misrespect for quiet competence, earned through survival rather than proclaimed through volume. Jake Carson had become her staunchest defender, positioned himself as the wall between Sarah and anyone who didn't understand what she represented, and the irony of that transformation wasn't lost on anyone who'd witnessed their first days together. The morning the new training cycle began, fresh candidates arrived with their duffel bags and assumptions, filling the same locker room where Sarah had first encountered dismissive silence. Jake stood near the equipment cages with Marcus and Derek, watching the intake process, when one of the new arrivals, a tall kid from Texas with swagger he hadn't earned, noticed a female soldier struggling with her oversized pack and laughed to his buddy. "Give her 2 days before she washes out," the kid said, loud enough to carry. Jake moved before he'd consciously decided to, crossing the room in 4 strides, his presence suddenly filling the space in front of the new recruit. "You don't know her story," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying an edge that made the kid's smile disappear. "You don't know anyone's story, so maybe keep your assumptions to yourself and let people prove what they can do." He glanced back at Sarah, who stood near the doorway with her arms crossed, watching the scene unfold, and that slight smile appeared on her face, the same knowing expression she'd given him on the helicopter 2 months ago when he'd made his own stupid predictions about her capabilities. Captain Richards observed from his office window overlooking the training yard, coffee cup in hand. And he watched Jake return to his position, watched Sarah nod almost imperceptibly before turning away, watched the new recruit's face register confusion and then thoughtfulness. As he looked around the room and recognized something in the atmosphere he couldn't quite name, Richards allowed himself a small smile of his own, because the lesson had finally been learned, had taken root in soil that would nurture it forward, and Sarah Mitchell could return to being what she'd always wanted to be, Not a ghost, not a cautionary tale, not a symbol, but simply a soldier moving forward one day at a time, carrying her past quietly, while others finally learned to look beyond their assumptions and see what was actually there.